Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
A friend and I had one of the most frightening experiences of our lives while staying on a small island off the coast of Bali. The fact that we were on mushrooms makes the story difficult to tell without people immediately dismissing it. I understand why they do. Psychedelics can alter color, distance, movement, sound, and a person's sense of meaning. A harmless place can suddenly feel sacred, threatening, or completely unreal. A few branches can seem alive. A shadow can look like an animal. A normal experience can become an enormous event in your mind. I am not claiming that every thought I had that night was rational. At one point, I genuinely wondered whether we had found some kind of entrance to the Garden of Eden. That part was obviously the mushrooms. The trees and snakes, however, were real. We confirmed that later. It happened during low tide. My friend and I had taken mushrooms and were walking near the coast at night. The water had pulled far back from the normal shoreline, exposing a wide stretch of wet ground that would have been underwater at high tide. The landscape already felt strange before we found anything unusual. Low tide can make the coast look like a completely different place. Areas that are normally hidden beneath the ocean suddenly become open land. Rocks, mud, roots, pools, shells, and channels appear where there had only been water a few hours earlier. At night, it looked even less familiar. The ground reflected small amounts of light, but most of the area beyond us disappeared into darkness. We could hear the sea farther out, though it felt distant because the tide had receded so much. Because we were under the influence, every sensation felt more intense. The air seemed heavier. The wet ground beneath our feet felt alive. The sound of water moving through shallow channels seemed louder and more complicated than it probably was. We started walking farther out. At the time, it felt like an adventure. We were not trying to do anything dangerous. We were curious about how far the tide had gone and what the exposed ocean floor looked like. Neither of us knew the area well enough to understand what might be hidden out there. We had no guide. We were simply two tourists walking into darkness, while our judgment and perception were already altered. After traveling some distance from the shore, we saw a cluster of trees. That was the first thing that felt genuinely wrong. The trees appeared to be growing out in the middle of the ocean. They were not along the normal coast. They stood far enough from land that, at high tide, the area around them would probably have been surrounded or covered by water. From where we approached, it looked like a small grove had somehow formed in a place where no grove should exist. I assume now they may have been mangroves or another kind of tree adapted to saltwater and tidal areas. At the time, we did not think through the biology. We only saw dark trunks and branches rising from the exposed ground in the middle of the sea. The sight was beautiful and unsettling. The trees looked separate from the normal world behind us. They formed their own small space out on the tidal flat, almost like an island that only existed when the water moved away. We walked toward them. As we got closer, the ground became more difficult. There may have been mud, shallow pools, exposed roots, and uneven sections hidden in the darkness. We had to watch where we stepped, although our attention kept returning to the trees. They looked twisted and closely packed. Some of the roots rose above the ground or water. The branches created dark shapes overhead. Once we reached the grove, we began walking between the trees. That was when the experience became much more intense. Inside the grove, our view of the shore was partly blocked. The trees surrounded us, and the darkness seemed thicker between them. The open coast had at least offered a wide view, but among the trunks and branches, it was difficult to tell what was ahead. The mushrooms probably increased the feeling that we had entered another place. The transition from open tidal ground into a tight group of trees felt almost symbolic. One moment, we were walking through the exposed ocean. The next, we were inside a dark forest that should not have been there. I remember looking at the branches and thinking they seemed unusually detailed. Every root, leaf, and shadow demanded attention. Then, one of us noticed movement. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. There was a long shape wrapped around one of the branches. Then another, then another. The trees were full of snakes, not one or two. There were so many that once we recognized them, they seemed to be everywhere. Some were stretched along branches. Others were wrapped around them. A few appeared to be moving slowly through the trees. Their bodies blended so well with the wood and shadows that we had walked into the grove before noticing them. That realization was terrifying. We had already been standing beneath them. We did not know whether any had been directly above our heads. We did not know whether we had stepped near snakes on the ground or among the roots. We did not know whether they were venomous. All we knew was that we were surrounded by far more snakes than either of us had ever seen in one place. Because we were tripping, the number may have felt even larger than it was. I can admit that. A group of 10 snakes could have seemed like 50. Shadows may have looked like additional bodies. Branches could have appeared to move after we had already become frightened. But there were definitely many snakes in those trees. The fear was not invented. The moment we understood what surrounded us, every branch became dangerous. Every dark curve looked alive. I became aware of how little clothing and protection we had. A snake could drop from above. One could strike from the roots. We had no light strong enough to identify the species or even see a safe route out clearly. The mushrooms did not create the danger, but they made the danger harder to measure. I could not calmly decide which snakes were harmless or how close they were. My body immediately reacted as though we were about to die. We ran. I do not think I have ever moved faster in my life. Running through an unfamiliar tidal area at night was dangerous by itself. The ground was uneven, wet, and possibly muddy. A person could easily slip, twist an ankle, step into a hole, or fall onto the roots. None of that mattered in the moment. The only thought in my mind was to get away from the grove. We crashed back through the trees and out onto the exposed shore. I was terrified that something would fall onto me. I imagined snakes dropping onto my shoulders or becoming tangled around my legs. Every time grass, a root, or water touched my skin, I thought I had been bitten. My friend was running too, shouting or breathing hard beside me. The videos we made later captured mostly darkness and screaming, which is probably an accurate record of our mental state. We did not stop to film properly when we first noticed the snakes. We were far more interested in escaping. The grove disappeared behind us, but I kept looking back. In the altered state I was in, the place felt less like an animal habitat and more like something we had accidentally discovered. That was when my mind began turning it into something mythological. Snakes, a hidden grove, trees growing in the sea, a place that appeared only when the tide moved away. The symbolism was almost too obvious. I started talking about the Garden of Eden, a portal, or some ancient forbidden place. I do not remember exactly how seriously I believed those ideas. Psychedelic thoughts can exist in a strange space between imagination and certainty. In the moment, a ridiculous theory can feel profound. Part of me knew we had probably found a natural habitat. Another part felt that we had crossed some invisible boundary. The snakes became guardians. The grove became an entrance. Our fear became proof that we had seen something we were not supposed to see. That was the drug influencing the meaning of the experience. But it did not invent the physical scene. We eventually made it back to our hostel. We were still frightened and excited, and we immediately began telling people what had happened. We described the trees standing in the tidal area. We told them the grove was filled with snakes. We probably spoke too quickly and included the more extreme ideas about portals and Eden. That made us less believable. Everyone knew we had taken mushrooms. They assumed we had hallucinated the entire thing. To them, the explanation was easy. Two people used psychedelics, wandered outside at night, saw branches moving, and convinced themselves they had discovered a forest full of snakes. The people at the hostel may have heard many similar stories from travelers. Someone takes drugs, sees something ordinary, and returns with a supernatural explanation. They had no reason to trust our judgment. We tried to show them the videos. The recordings were terrible. The screens showed mostly darkness. There were brief, unclear shapes and sudden movements as the camera shook. Our voices and screams were much clearer than the snakes. Nothing in the footage proved what we had seen. If anything, it made us look more intoxicated and frightened. A person watching the videos could easily say we had been filming empty trees. I became frustrated because I knew there had been something real beneath the exaggeration. I did not expect anyone to believe the Garden of Eden idea. I did expect them to believe we had found a grove containing a large number of snakes. The lack of evidence made the story sound like a hallucination. My friend and I began questioning ourselves, too. Once we were back under normal lights and around other people, the experience felt less certain. Had there really been that many snakes? Could roots and vines have looked like bodies? Were we both influencing each other? Perhaps one of us said, "Those are snakes," and the other person's altered mind immediately transformed every branch into one. Shared suggestion is powerful, especially while using psychedelics. If one frightened person reacts strongly, the other begins looking for the same threat. The fear then confirms itself. We had both seen movement, but that did not mean every shape was alive. The people around us kept repeating that we had been tripping. Eventually, we decided there was only one way to know. We would return. A couple of hours later, when the effects had reduced and our thinking was clearer, we went back toward the same place. This was not the smartest decision. Even if the snakes were real, we were deliberately returning to an area full of them at night. The tide could also have begun rising. A route that was open earlier might become covered by water. Tidal flats can change quickly, and becoming trapped offshore would have been extremely dangerous. We were fortunate that nothing happened. We followed the same general path. The grove was still there. That alone confirmed that we had not invented the trees. They really were growing out in the tidal area. We approached more carefully this time. We did not rush inside. We looked closely at the branches. The snakes were still there. The grove genuinely contained many of them. Our altered minds may have exaggerated the number, size, or movement, but the basic experience had been real. We had walked into a tree-filled area in the middle of the exposed coast and found it occupied by snakes. I felt two opposite reactions. The first was relief. We were not completely hallucinating. The people at the hostel had been wrong to dismiss everything. There was a real place and a real danger. The second reaction was renewed fear. The return confirmed how close we had been to those animals while our judgment was impaired. We had entered without noticing them. We had walked beneath branches crowded with snakes. We had no idea what species they were or how dangerous they might have been. The fact that none attacked us did not mean we had been safe. Most snakes avoid humans if they can. They may have remained still because they did not see us as immediate threats. Our panicked running could easily have caused one to react. We were lucky. There are several natural explanations for why so many snakes might have gathered there. The trees may have been mangroves or another tidal species that created a perfect resting place. Snakes can climb trees to hunt, avoid water, rest, or escape predators. Low tide may have concentrated them in the grove. Some could have been sea snakes using the exposed roots and branches. Others may have lived in the coastal habitat permanently. The location probably was not mysterious to local people at all. It may have been a known place where snakes gathered. We were simply visitors who knew nothing about the environment. That ignorance turned a natural habitat into something unreal. The tide also explains why the grove appeared to stand in the middle of the ocean. At high tide, water probably surrounded the trunks. At low tide, the ground became walkable. The landscape was not defying nature. It was part of a tidal ecosystem we did not understand. The snakes belonged there. We did not. Looking back, the most frightening part is how easily curiosity overpowered caution. We saw trees in an unusual place and immediately walked into them. We did not consider that the grove might shelter wildlife. We did not check the tide schedule. We did not bring proper lights. We did not tell anyone where we were going. We were also on mushrooms, which made us more likely to follow whatever seemed interesting. The experience could have ended badly without anything supernatural happening. We could have been bitten. We could have fallen and injured ourselves. The tide could have returned while we were far from shore. We could have become disoriented and walked into deeper water. A natural place can be deadly without feeling threatening at first. The grove looked strange and beautiful. That made us want to enter. The danger was hidden in the same shapes we were admiring. I still think about how long the snakes must have been visible before we noticed them. They did not suddenly appear. They had probably been lying on the branches the entire time. We walked closer. We stepped among the roots. We looked around. Only then did our brains understand what we were seeing. That delayed recognition is terrifying. Once the pattern became clear, I could not stop seeing them. Before that moment, the snakes had been part of the trees. Afterward, the trees seemed made of snakes. The mushrooms probably intensified that change. Psychedelics often cause patterns to emerge from complicated surfaces. Bark, leaves, water, and shadows can appear to move. In this case, the moving patterns contained actual animals. The hallucination and reality may have overlapped. Some branches looked like snakes because our perception was altered. Some snakes looked even larger or more numerous for the same reason. But there were enough real snakes to justify the fear. That is why the story still stands out from any other experience I had while tripping. Usually, once the effects fade, the strange vision disappears. A wall stops breathing. A pattern becomes ordinary again. A frightening shadow is revealed as furniture. This time, we returned and found the central image still waiting. The grove remained in the tidal flat. The snakes still occupied the branches. The trip had changed our interpretation, but not the reality underneath it. I do not believe now that we found a supernatural portal. I do not think the trees led to the Garden of Eden. Those ideas came from an intoxicated mind trying to give meaning to an overwhelming scene. The connection was easy to make. A hidden grove filled with snakes naturally reminded me of an ancient garden and forbidden knowledge. That did not make it true, but I understand why the thought felt powerful at the time. The place seemed removed from normal geography. The tide had opened a path to it. The trees stood where we expected open water. The snakes watched from every direction. Then, only hours later, the ocean would begin reclaiming the route. It felt like a place that existed temporarily. In reality, it existed all the time. We were only able to reach it during low tide. That may be even more interesting than the supernatural version. There are environments close to human settlements that remain almost invisible unless the conditions are right. People can live, travel, and sleep nearby without knowing what appears when the water withdraws. We happened to explore at the exact time the path was exposed. The experience also taught me how difficult it is to describe something real when the circumstances make you an unreliable witness. The moment we admitted we were on mushrooms, everyone stopped listening. Their skepticism was reasonable. We had impaired our own ability to observe accurately. Our story included exaggerated ideas. Our videos showed almost nothing. There was no reason for anyone else to separate the real details from the hallucinated meaning. Yet being unreliable does not mean every observation is false. A person can be intoxicated and still encounter a real animal, place, or threat. The problem is determining which parts are accurate. In our case, returning later gave us that confirmation. The grove existed. The snakes existed. The only uncertain parts were the scale and the story our minds built around them. I sometimes wish the videos had been clearer. A good recording would have shown how many snakes were actually there and what kind they were. It might also have helped us understand whether the danger was as severe as it felt. Instead, the footage captured only darkness, panic, and movement. That may be appropriate. The experience was not calm enough to document properly. We were not standing at a safe distance filming wildlife. We were inside the grove before we understood what surrounded us. By the time we started recording, we were already running. The videos preserve the fear, but not its source. People who watch them see two intoxicated travelers screaming into darkness. They do not see what we saw above and around us. I have tried to identify the snakes in memory, but the details are too uncertain. It was dark. We were moving. The visual effects of the mushrooms changed color and shape. I cannot honestly describe exact markings or species. Some may have been harmless tree snakes. Others might have been dangerous. It would be irresponsible to claim we were surrounded by deadly animals without knowing. The lack of an attack suggests they were not actively aggressive. But even venomous snakes usually do not attack without reason. We may simply have passed through without provoking them enough. The return trip confirmed the animals, but did not make us experts. We observed from more of a distance and left. We had already taken enough risks. No one was injured. We made it back safely. The hostile guests probably continued believing we had exaggerated everything. That no longer mattered. My friend and I had confirmed it for ourselves. We knew the difference between the wild thoughts produced by the trip and the physical place that remained after those thoughts faded. The portal was not real. The Garden of Eden was not real. The grove full of snakes was. Even now, it is one of the scariest things I have ever seen. Not because it was paranormal, but because it felt supernatural before revealing itself as something entirely natural and possibly dangerous. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from discovering you have already entered the threat before noticing it. We did not see the snakes from a safe distance and decide whether to approach. We walked beneath them. We surrounded ourselves with them. Then the branches resolved into bodies. I still remember the instant when the first snake became visible. My eyes followed its length around the branch. Then I noticed another shape behind it. Then several more. The whole grove changed. What had looked like a strange collection of trees became a living enclosure. For several seconds, we stood in the middle of it, trying to decide whether we could trust our own eyes. Then we ran harder than either of us had probably ever run before. People can blame the mushrooms for the Garden of Eden theory, the sense of entering another world, and the way the number of snakes seemed almost impossible. They would be right. But a couple of hours later, when our minds were clearer, we returned to the same tidal ground. The trees were still standing out in the dark, and the branches were still full of snakes. When we were kids, we lived in Pennsylvania near the kind of place that gave us almost unlimited freedom to explore. There was an old, abandoned farmhouse nearby, a trailer park, a large cornfield, and miles of woods stretching farther than we had ever bothered to walk. For kids, it felt like the perfect place to grow up. There was always somewhere to go. We could wander around the abandoned property, follow trails through the trees, cut across the fields, or disappear into the woods for hours and still find new places. The old farmhouse was especially interesting. It had been empty for as long as we could remember. The windows were dark, the wood looked aged, and the entire building seemed as though it had slowly been left behind by the rest of the world. We knew better than to trust the floors or climb around too much inside, but simply having it nearby gave the area a sense of history. Someone had lived there once. Someone had worked the land, used the fields, and walked the same paths we explored. By the time we were children, most of that activity was gone. The farmhouse was empty, the woods were thick, and the surrounding land belonged mostly to animals, weeds, and children with too much imagination. We would find large sticks and pretend they were swords. Sometimes we became knights. Sometimes we were soldiers, warriors, or characters from whatever movie or game we had recently seen. The cornfield became an army of enemies. We would charge through it, swinging our sticks and cutting down corn stalks, as if we were fighting our way through a battle. When we went deeper into the woods, we did the same thing with weeds. There were places where the plants grew nearly as tall as we were. We would swing our sticks from side to side. Clearing paths and pretending the weeds were bad guys trying to surround us. It was simple, stupid fun. We were loud. We argued over who had the best sword. We challenged each other, fought imaginary enemies, and probably destroyed far more vegetation than we should have. Nothing about the woods frightened us during the day. We had spent enough time there that the area felt like an extension of our neighborhood. The woods could become dark in places, and there were sections we avoided when we were alone, but when several of us went together, we felt safe. On the day this happened, my brother, a friend, and I were exploring one of the overgrown areas. There may have been another kid with us, too. In my memory, there were several of us, enough that when everyone ran, it felt like the entire group disappeared at once. We were swinging our sticks through weeds and brush, talking loudly and paying very little attention to anything beyond our game. The weather did not seem unusual. I do not remember strong wind. There was no storm moving in. The trees were not bending or cracking around us. The forest sounded normal. Then we heard a loud crash. It came from somewhere ahead. The sound was much heavier than a branch falling. There was a deep cracking noise followed by the violent impact of something large hitting the ground. We stopped what we were doing. About 50 yards away, a tree had fallen. It was difficult to see every detail through the brush, but we could tell it had come down. The top had disappeared into the surrounding growth, and the sound of branches breaking continued for a second after the main impact. At first, none of us panicked. Trees fall in forests. They become rotten, lose support, or get damaged during storms. Sometimes they remain standing until one final shift causes them to collapse. We assumed that was what happened. We waited to hear someone shouting or a machine running. Nothing followed. There were no chainsaws, no engines, no construction equipment, no voices. The area was too deep in the woods for normal work to be happening without us hearing it. If loggers had been cutting trees, there would have been trucks, equipment, or at least the constant sound of saws. Instead, the forest went quiet again. We looked at each other and tried to decide whether we should walk toward the fallen tree. Before we could, another tree came down. The second crash was just as loud. There was the same splitting sound, then branches tearing through other branches as the trunk hit the ground. This tree fell in roughly the same direction as the first. That was when the situation stopped feeling normal. One dead tree falling by itself could happen. A second tree falling only moments later was harder to dismiss. We still did not hear wind. There was no storm. Nothing obvious had struck the trees. We listened for a chainsaw again. There was only silence. A short time later, another tree fell. By then, I was terrified. The crashes were not far away. 50 yards in the woods is close enough that a falling tree feels enormous. The sound carries through the ground and the air. You feel the impact almost as much as you hear it. Each crash suggested that something powerful was moving ahead of us. I remember looking in that direction and trying to see between the trees. There was no person visible, no machine, no large animal that I could identify. Only brush, weeds, tree trunks, and the newly opened spaces where the trees had fallen. Then the bushes began moving. At first, it was only a small disturbance. The weeds shifted in a place where there did not seem to be any wind. Then, more of the brush moved. The movement seemed to travel from the direction of the fallen trees toward us. It was not like a single branch shaking. It looked as though something was forcing its way through the vegetation. The weeds bent, bushes pushed aside. The disturbance created a path that came closer in stages. Whatever was moving did not seem small. A rabbit or raccoon might shake a few plants near the ground, but this movement affected a much wider area. It appeared as though something large was coming directly toward us. None of us waited to find out what it was. The others turned and ran. They took off as fast as they could, crashing through the same weeds we had been cutting moments earlier. I followed immediately. There was no discussion. No one said we should stay calm or investigate. The sight of the brush moving toward us was enough. We ran like something was chasing us. Branches caught at our clothes. The ground was uneven, and I remember worrying that I would trip. I could hear the other kids ahead of me, breathing hard and pushing through the plants. No one wanted to be last. While we were running, another tree crashed behind us. That sound made us move even faster. It seemed to confirm that whatever had been knocking them down was still active. I did not turn around. I imagined something enormous moving through the woods, pushing over trees and clearing a path behind us. My mind filled in the details, even though I had seen nothing. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was a person with some kind of equipment. Maybe it was something much bigger than any animal that should have lived there. At that age, fear did not need a clear explanation. We only knew that several trees had fallen without warning, and something was moving through the brush in our direction. That was enough. We ran until we were well away from the area. I do not remember exactly where we stopped. It may have been closer to the trailer park, the farmhouse, or one of the familiar paths near our homes. We eventually slowed down and tried to catch our breath. Once we were no longer surrounded by the trees, the experience became harder to explain. We asked each other what we had seen. None of us had seen the actual cause. We had seen trees fall. We had watched the bushes move. We had heard another crash while escaping. But no one could identify an animal or person. The fact that several of us had witnessed the same thing prevented us from dismissing it as one child becoming frightened. Something had happened in those woods. The only question was what. We could have told an adult immediately. Maybe we did mention it, but I do not remember anyone taking the story seriously. Children running out of the woods and saying something was knocking down trees sounds like an exaggeration. An adult might assume we heard a logger, saw storm-damaged trees falling, or frightened ourselves after one tree collapsed naturally. Without seeing the cause, there was nothing specific to report. Part of us was curious. The fear faded slightly once we were home and safe. We began wondering whether the trees had truly fallen, or whether distance and noise had confused us. Maybe large branches had broken instead. Perhaps we had run because the moving weeds made an ordinary event seem threatening. The next day, we went back. That probably says everything about how children think. The day before, we had been convinced something dangerous was coming through the woods. Less than 4 hours later, curiosity pulled us into the same area. We did not go carelessly. I remember being more alert. Every sound made us stop. We watched the tree line and listened for movement. The woods looked normal again. There were no machines, no workers, no strange tracks leading toward us. But the trees were down. They were not branches. Several full trees lay on the ground where we had seen and heard them fall. Their trunks stretched through the brush, crushing smaller plants beneath them. The scene proved that the crashes had been real. We had not imagined the trees collapsing. We also found a trail through the bushes and weeds. A wide section of vegetation had been flattened. Plants were bent, broken, or pressed into the ground. The trail seemed to come from the same direction as the fallen trees. It looked as though something large had moved through. That was exactly what we thought we had seen the previous day. The bushes had not simply shaken. Something had created a path. We looked for footprints. I do not remember finding any. The ground may have been too dry, too covered with leaves, or too damaged by the falling trees to preserve clear tracks. There were no obvious boot prints, no tire marks, nothing that gave us an answer. The trail could have been caused by the trees themselves. When a tree falls, its branches can sweep through a large area and flatten bushes. If several trees fell in sequence, their tops and limbs might create what looked like a path. The movement we saw could have been branches continuing to settle after the main trunks hit the ground. A large branch might bend slowly under weight, then drag through weeds. From 50 yards away, that could look like something approaching. That is one reasonable explanation. Perhaps the first tree fell and struck another. The second tree then hit a third, creating a chain reaction. That would explain why several trees came down only moments apart. The crashes could continue as pressure moved through the surrounding vegetation. What looked like an unseen creature pushing through the brush may have been the tops of falling trees, forcing smaller plants aside. The fourth crash we heard while running could have been the final tree in the chain. Forests can behave that way. A dead or damaged tree falls into another and transfers enough force to bring it down. If roots are weak or the soil is wet, several trees may collapse together. We were children and might not have understood the mechanics. The delay between each fall made them seem separate, but branches and trunks could have remained tangled for seconds before another tree gave way. That explanation fits much of what happened. I do not remember the trees lying directly on top of one another, though they seemed spaced apart enough that one might not have struck the next. Memory after many years is not precise, and we never measured the distances. The tops of large trees can reach farther than expected. A trunk 50 feet tall can strike something that seems far away from its base. The chain reaction may have occurred above our view. Wind is another possibility. A strong gust can move through the upper canopy even when the air feels still near the ground. Trees at the edge of an opening may catch wind differently. If several were already weakened, one sudden gust could bring them down. The thick woods around us might have blocked the wind at our height. We would hear the crashes without feeling the force that caused them. After the gust passed, the forest would become quiet again. But I do not remember leaves thrashing or branches swaying. There was no roaring sound through the treetops. The weeds around us were still until the movement began in one specific direction. A small, localized gust is possible, but it did not feel like weather. The trees may also have been diseased or damaged. Rot can hollow out trunks from the inside while the outside still looks strong. Insects, fungus, and old lightning strikes can weaken several trees in one area. If the roots were growing in wet or unstable soil, the weight of one falling tree could disturb the ground enough to affect the others. The trail of crushed brush might have been caused by uprooted roots and falling crowns. Again, that is a practical explanation. We were near old farmland and woods that may not have been maintained. Dead trees were probably common. Logging activity might also have taken place earlier. Workers could have partially cut several trees and left them standing temporarily. Later, the trees finally fell after the trunks weakened. That would explain why they came down near one another. The absence of workers at the time would not matter. Someone could have been there days before. But when we returned, I do not remember seeing clean saw cuts. The trees looked broken or uprooted rather than deliberately cut. We were children, though, and may not have inspected the bases closely. A cut hidden by grass or dirt could have gone unnoticed. The wide trail through the vegetation also could have been made by logging machinery earlier, then become overgrown enough to look fresh only after the trees fell across it. The woods contained plenty of human history. Old farm paths, abandoned equipment routes, and forgotten property lines can disappear beneath weeds. Something that looked mysterious to us may have been ordinary land management. A large animal remains possible. Pennsylvania has black bears. A bear moving through tall weeds can create a clear trail and make bushes shake strongly. If one was frightened by the falling trees, it might have run toward us without realizing we were there. The movement we saw could have been a bear pushing through the vegetation. That would explain why it seemed large and why the trail remained the next day. The trees falling may have been unrelated. One or more trees collapsed, frightened a bear hiding nearby, and caused it to run. From our angle, it looked like the same thing had knocked down the trees and was coming for us. That may be the simplest, complete explanation. We never saw the animal because the weeds were high. It changed direction after we ran or stopped before reaching us. The trail was real because a bear had passed through. The fallen trees were real because they were old or damaged. Two natural events happened at the same time and became one terrifying experience. Deer could also create a trail, especially several deer moving together. A startled herd can crash loudly through brush, but the movement seemed too heavy and direct. Deer usually bound and changed direction quickly. We might have seen their heads or bodies above the plants. A bear would remain lower and be harder to identify. There may have been feral livestock near the old farmhouse. A cow, pig, or horse that escaped from somewhere could move through weeds and create a broad trail. The abandoned agricultural land may still have been used by someone farther away. But we never saw fences, hoof prints, or any sign of such an animal. A person could have been hiding in the woods. Someone cutting trees illegally might have heard children approaching and moved away through the brush. Maybe they used a handsaw, axe, or ropes rather than powered equipment. That seems unlikely because dropping several trees would require time and create earlier noises. We would have heard chopping or sawing before the first fall. There was also no reason for the person to move toward us after the trees came down. Still, people sometimes do strange things in isolated places. The old farmhouse and trailer park meant strangers could move through the area without us knowing everyone. Someone may have wanted to scare children away. They could have pushed dead trees, thrown objects, or moved through the bushes deliberately. But knocking down full trees as a prank would be dangerous and difficult. We never saw anyone. The more frightening explanations came from our imaginations. We imagined something massive and unknown living deep in the woods. At that age, we had probably heard stories about Bigfoot, monsters, ghosts, and people hiding in abandoned houses. A creature strong enough to push over trees fit the scene immediately. The crushed path looked as though a huge body had forced its way through. The fact that we never saw it made it easier to imagine anything. If we had seen a bear, the fear would have had a shape and an ending. Instead, the trees fell, the brush moved, and we ran before the cause appeared. The unknown continued moving behind us. Even now, I do not think something supernatural had to be there. There are too many natural explanations. Falling trees can create chain reactions. Large animals can move through weeds unseen. Wind can affect the canopy without being obvious on the ground. Children can misjudge distance and connect separate events. The next day, evidence supports that something physical happened, not necessarily something paranormal. The trees were real. The flattened trail was real. Neither proves a monster. But I still remember how wrong it felt. The first crash surprised us. The second made us nervous. The third created fear. Then the bushes began moving toward us. The timing felt like a progression. It was as though something had been clearing a path. One obstacle fell, then another, then another. Once the way was open, the thing moved through the weeds. That interpretation may have formed entirely because we were scared, but it was immediate. We did not stand there debating what kind of animal it might be. We ran because every part of us believed something large was coming. Children often have good instincts about danger, even when they misunderstand the cause. Running was probably the correct decision. If it was a bear, staying would have been dangerous. If unstable trees were continuing to fall, the area was unsafe. If a person was cutting them, we were too close. Whatever caused the activity, leaving protected us. The strange part is that we kept playing there afterward. We avoided that particular area for a while, but the woods were too much a part of our childhood to abandon completely. Fear faded. The familiar trails became normal again. We returned with sticks, cut down imaginary enemies, and continued exploring. Nothing similar happened again. No more rows of trees fell near us. We never saw a large creature. There were no reports of missing animals, strange tracks, or people working secretly in the woods. The incident remained isolated. That supports a natural accident. Several weakened trees fell, possibly triggered by one another, while an animal moved through the brush. The combination frightened a group of children and became a mystery because no one stayed to investigate. That is probably all it was. But the next day trail still bothers me. The vegetation was not only flattened around the fallen trunks, there seemed to be a clear route through the bushes, continuing in the direction of the movement we had seen. It looked as though something passed through after the trees came down. The plants were crushed low, not merely swaying. We could follow the disturbed area. We never found where it ended or what made it. Maybe we became too nervous to follow far. Perhaps the trail faded into the woods where the ground changed. Without tracks, droppings, fur, or another sign, we could not identify the animal. I sometimes wonder whether we would recognize the answer immediately if we returned as adults. The trees might look smaller. The distances might be shorter than memory suggests. The trail could clearly align with fallen branches. What seemed like a remote wilderness may have been close to a logging road or property line. Childhood turns familiar land into something enormous. 50 yards can feel like half a mile. A medium-sized bear can seem gigantic through weeds. 3 dead trees falling close together can feel like deliberate destruction. The adult version of the place might explain everything, but the woods have probably changed. Trees have grown or been cut. The old farmhouse may be gone. New homes or roads might cover the places we explored. Even if I found the clearing, the evidence from that day disappeared years ago. I would only be standing in a location attached to a memory. There is no way to test what happened now. All I have is the sequence. My brother, our friend, and I were cutting weeds with sticks. A tree crashed down roughly 50 yards ahead. There were no workers, chainsaws, machines, or warning sounds. Then another tree fell. Then another. The bushes began moving from that direction toward us. We ran. Another tree crashed while we were escaping. The next day, the fallen trees were still there. The weeds and bushes had been flattened into a trail as though something large had come through. We never discovered what it was. Maybe the first tree knocked down the others. Maybe a bear panicked and ran through the brush. Maybe old logging work had weakened the trunks. Those explanations are believable, and one of them is probably correct. But I still remember the moment before we ran. The trees around us were standing still. The air was calm. Then the brush began parting in a line from the place where the trees had fallen. Whatever was hidden inside it was moving directly toward us. We never saw its body. We only saw the path it made. And when we returned the next morning, the woods had kept the evidence of everything except what had walked through them. When I was about 10 years old, my family had a new corded telephone installed in our house. This was long before everyone carried a phone in their pocket. The house phone was connected to the wall, and the receiver sat in a cradle on top of the base. If someone called, that phone rang loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear it. At 10 years old, I was curious about anything new in the house. The phone was not a toy, but I treated it like one when no one was paying attention. I liked picking up the receiver, listening to the dial tone, pressing buttons, and hearing the different sounds the line made. There was something strange and interesting about holding the receiver to my ear and knowing that the wire connected our house to people far away. On this particular day, I became interested in the small button beneath the receiver. When the handset was placed in the cradle, its weight pushed that button down and ended the call. When you lifted the receiver, the button rose and opened the line. I did not know the proper name for it then. I only knew that pressing it while holding the phone to my ear caused the line to switch on and off. I lifted the receiver and began pressing the button repeatedly. Each time I pushed it down, I heard a click. When I released it, I heard another. Click, 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 the dial tone would appear briefly and then vanish as I pressed the button again. I kept doing it because I wanted to know whether anything different would happen if I pressed it quickly enough. It was the kind of pointless experiment a child performs without thinking about whether it could damage something or accidentally call someone. At first, nothing unusual happened. There were only the mechanical clicks of the line opening and closing. I continued pressing the button. Click, click, click. Then the clicking stopped. Instead of the dial tone or silence, I heard laughter. It came through the receiver suddenly and at full volume. It did not sound like a normal person chuckling because they had answered the phone by mistake. It was hysterical. The person on the other end sounded as though they were laughing uncontrollably. But there was nothing joyful about it. The laughter was high, wild, and cruel. Even now, the closest comparison I can make is the way a goblin or demon laughs in a frightening story while tormenting someone. It sounded delighted by fear. There were no words, no greeting, no question about who was calling. Only laughter pouring directly into my ear. For a second, I could not move. I had been expecting another click. My mind was not prepared to hear a voice. I remember the immediate feeling that whoever was laughing knew I was there. It did not feel like I had accidentally overheard something unrelated. The laughter sounded directed at me. That may have been only fear changing the way I understood it, but the reaction was instant. I slammed the receiver back onto the phone. The laughter stopped because the line disconnected. I stood beside the phone, staring at it. My heart was beating hard. I tried to understand what had just happened. Maybe I had accidentally called someone. Perhaps repeatedly pressing the button had sent a signal through the telephone network. I did not know enough about phones to know whether that was possible. I had not dialed a number, but maybe the clicks had been interpreted as numbers. Old rotary phones worked by sending pulses through the line. I did not understand that at the time, but it is possible the button presses acted like pulse dialing. If I had pressed and released the switch in a certain pattern, perhaps I had accidentally connected to another telephone. That explanation would make sense. Maybe a person answered and decided to frighten the child on the line, but the laughter began immediately. I did not remember hearing ringing. There was no pause while a call connected. The clicking simply changed into a voice. I waited beside the phone for a moment. I was frightened, but part of me expected nothing else to happen. The line was closed. Whatever I had heard was gone. Then the telephone rang. The sound was so sudden that I nearly jumped out of my skin. The same phone I had just slammed down began ringing as though someone were calling our house. I did not answer. I ran. I left the room as quickly as I could and put as much distance as possible between myself and the telephone. I was convinced the person who had laughed was calling me back. The timing felt too exact to be a coincidence. I had heard the laughter. I had hung up. A second later, the phone rang. Whoever or whatever had been on the line seemed unwilling to let the conversation end. I do not remember who answered the call, if anyone did. Maybe the phone stopped ringing before another family member reached it. Perhaps someone picked it up and found no one there. It is possible an ordinary caller happened to ring at that exact moment. I was too frightened to remain nearby and find out. For years afterward, the event stayed with me. The laughter was the part I remembered most clearly. There are sounds that become less frightening with time because you learn what caused them. A pipe knocking in the wall is only plumbing. A branch scratching the window is only wind. A shadow in a bedroom is clothing hanging from a chair. But I never received a clear explanation for the voice on that phone. The fact that the phone rang afterward prevented me from dismissing it as random noise. If I had heard laughter and nothing else happened, I might believe I had accidentally connected to a conversation. The immediate call made it feel personal. There are several ordinary ways it could have happened. The simplest is that I accidentally placed the call by tapping the switch. Telephone systems once used pulse dialing. On a rotary phone, turning the dial and allowing it to return interrupted the line a specific number of times. One pulse represented the number 1, 2 pulses represented 2, and so on. The switch under a receiver could sometimes create similar pulses if pressed repeatedly. People who understood old telephone systems could dial numbers by tapping the hook switch in the correct pattern. I did not know this, but I may have accidentally created part or all of a number. If the timing happened to match a real telephone number, the network might have connected me to someone. That person may have heard clicking, breathing, or silence and decided to laugh into the phone. When I hung up, they could have called back if some system revealed our number or if the call connected through a local line they recognized. However, it seems unlikely that random button presses would form a complete valid number. I was not pressing in organized groups. I was simply clicking repeatedly to see what happened. I also do not remember entering enough pauses between groups to represent separate digits. The phone network might not have interpreted the pattern as dialing at all. There is also the question of how the person would know our number. Caller identification was not common in the same way it is now, especially depending on when and where this happened. A person receiving a strange call might not be able to immediately call back. The incoming ring may therefore have been unrelated. Another possibility is that I triggered an automatic telephone feature. Some old systems had ringback services used by technicians to test whether a phone line worked. A certain sequence could cause the phone to ring after the receiver was replaced. There were also services that returned a call, announced information, or connected users to recorded messages. By rapidly pressing the hook switch, I may have accidentally activated one of those functions. The laughter could have been part of a recording. Maybe I reached a test line, prank service, party line, or entertainment number. When I hung up, the system automatically rang our phone as part of the test. That explanation fits the sequence better than a stranger somehow learning our number instantly. It also explains why the call came back so quickly. But I do not know whether such a service existed on our line. I never learned what telephone company equipment was used in our area. No adult later explained that I had activated a ringback test. At 10 years old, I did not have the knowledge or confidence to recreate the event deliberately. After what happened, I did not want to touch the switch again. The laughter may also have come from crossed lines. Older telephone networks sometimes allowed voices from other calls to bleed into a line. Damaged wiring, moisture, incorrect connections, or problems at an exchange could cause one household to hear part of another conversation. I may have opened and closed the line repeatedly until it briefly connected to someone else's call. The laughter could have belonged to a real person speaking with someone completely unrelated to me. Because I heard only a small section, it sounded frightening and without context. Someone may have been watching a comedy, joking with friends, or laughing at something another person said. The sound became sinister only because it appeared suddenly after the mechanical clicking. The incoming call afterward may have been an ordinary family call that happened by coincidence. Coincidences like that feel impossible when they frighten us, but they happen. A phone can ring seconds after a strange line noise without the two events being connected. My memory naturally joined them into one sequence. That is possible. Still, I remember the laughter as too direct and intense to feel like part of a distant conversation. It filled the line. There was no background speech, no television sound, no second person. It was as though someone had placed their mouth close to a receiver and laughed only for me. Memory can sharpen frightening sounds over time, though I was a child. The original laugh may have been less monstrous than I remember. Maybe it lasted only a second. Maybe there were ordinary words before or after it that I forgot. Fear preserves the emotional shape of an event more strongly than technical details. The laughter remains demonic in my memory because that was how it made me feel. It may have been a normal adult voice distorted by the telephone. Old phone lines reduced sound quality. Static, limited frequency, and volume changes could make a human laugh sound unnatural. A voice through a receiver already feels disembodied. Without seeing a face, the mind imagines one. At 10 years old, my imagination supplied something inhuman. There is also a possibility that someone in the family or neighborhood was playing a prank. A relative might have known I was experimenting with the phone and called at the right time. Someone could have picked up an extension elsewhere in the house, laughed, then caused the phone to ring. But I do not remember anyone admitting it. If another phone was connected to the same line, a person could have listened while I clicked the switch. They might have made the sound to scare me. Then, they could have called from somewhere else. That would require careful timing and knowledge of what I was doing. I had not announced that I planned to play with the phone. The event felt spontaneous. A neighbor's child might also have been calling random numbers for fun. They could have reached our line just as I was pressing the switch. When I answered unknowingly, they laughed. After I hung up, they called again. This would explain everything without requiring advanced telephone features. Perhaps the line had already been ringing silently between my presses, and lifting the receiver connected the call. I may not have noticed the normal ring because I was holding the phone and repeatedly closing the circuit. The caller laughed when someone finally answered. When I slammed the receiver down, they called again. That is entirely plausible. But the timing in my memory is different. I remember generating the clicks myself. Then, without a ring, the laughter appeared. After I hung up, the phone rang almost immediately. Maybe that memory compressed the events. Perhaps the phone had rung before I lifted it and I forgot. Maybe I picked it up during an incoming call without realizing it. Childhood memories often remove small transitions and preserve only the surprising moments. The experience could therefore have been a prank caller from beginning to end. At the time, none of these explanations occurred to me. I did not think about pulse dialing, crossed lines, test services, or prank calls. I thought something had answered me. The repeated clicking felt like knocking on a door. I had opened and closed the line over and over, asking in the only way I knew whether something was there. Then, something laughed. When I slammed the phone down, it rang back. That was how my childhood mind understood it. I had attracted attention. The caller had not known about me until I began playing with the switch. Once the laughter started, I had been noticed. The ringing meant it now knew where to find me. The fear was not only that a frightening person had been on the line, it was that the phone had connected me to somewhere I had not intended to reach. Telephones already felt mysterious to me. A small device in our house could carry voices across cities and states through wires I could not see. I did not understand exchanges, routing, or electrical signals. The line seemed like an invisible space filled with unknown connections. Pressing the switch felt like opening and closing a door into that space. After the laughter, I imagined there might be things listening between calls. That idea stayed with me for a long time. I became cautious about answering the phone when no one else was nearby. If it rang unexpectedly, I sometimes hesitated. I remembered the voice laughing through the receiver and wondered whether it would be there again. I never heard it a second time. No similar call repeated. The phone worked normally afterward. That supports an ordinary explanation. A wiring problem, accidental connection, prank call, or automated service happened once and never returned. If something supernatural had entered through the line, I might expect continued calls, voices, or other activity. There was none. Still, a single event can remain frightening because it never provides enough evidence to explain itself. I have wondered whether the incoming call was the telephone company's automatic response to rapid hook switch flashing. Some systems recognize briefly pressing the switch as a command for call waiting, transfer, or another service. Repeatedly flashing it may have confused the line or connected me to an operator. An operator or technician might have heard a child clicking repeatedly and laughed. Then they could have rung the line back to check whether the connection worked. The laughter would be unprofessional, but people sometimes react strangely. Perhaps the sound was not even laughter. It may have been a test tone, signal, interference, or electronic oscillation that my young brain interpreted as a voice. Telephone lines could produce squeals, pulses, and distorted sounds. A rapidly changing signal might resemble hysterical laughter. When I became frightened, I assigned it a human or demonic quality. The phone ringing afterward could then be part of an automated test. That may be the best technical explanation. But I remember the sound having emotion. It rose and fell like someone laughing. There was rhythm, breath, and cruelty in it. I did not hear a machine. I heard a person enjoying something. Again, that may reflect memory rather than the original sound. Our brains are built to detect voices, even inside noise. A random signal can sound like speech if it has the right pattern. People hear words in static and music in machinery. A child expecting clicks may interpret an unexpected electronic noise as laughter. The more frightened I became, the clearer the imagined person behind it seemed. The callback is still harder to separate emotionally. Even if the ring had a normal cause, it came at the worst possible moment. I had just ended contact with something terrifying. The phone immediately demanded that I reconnect. A ringing telephone is normally an invitation. That time, it felt like a threat. I did not wait to see whether it would ring again. I did not count the rings or listen for someone else to answer. I ran because I believed the laughter would return the moment the receiver was lifted. I sometimes wish an adult had answered it while I was still nearby. If they had picked up and said it was a relative, wrong number, or empty line, the memory might not have remained so powerful. If they had heard the laughter too, at least I would have known it was real. Instead, I escaped before the story reached an ending. The phone rang behind me, and I left the room. I never learned who was calling. That missing answer gave my imagination space to grow. For all I know, the call was from my mother, father, another relative, or a neighbor. Someone may have been trying to reach the house at the exact moment I was playing with the line. The laughter might have belonged to a separate crossed connection. Two unrelated events became one frightening story because they occurred seconds apart. Statistically, unlikely coincidences happen to people every day. We remember the ones that feel meaningful. A child playing with a phone hears a strange voice. Then, the phone rings. The sequence feels designed, even if it is not. I can accept that logically. Emotionally, the memory still feels like a response. I pressed the button. The line clicked. I kept pressing. Something replaced the clicking with laughter. I hung up. It called back. There was an action and reaction to every part. That structure is why the event never felt random. I also cannot forget how quickly my body understood the sound as dangerous. There was no slow uncertainty. I did not listen for a long time and decide it was creepy. The laughter began, and I immediately felt terror. Sometimes the body reacts to unfamiliar sounds because they are loud or sudden, not because they contain actual danger. A harmless balloon popping can trigger panic. A distorted voice on a telephone can activate the same response. The fear does not prove anything about the caller, but it proves how wrong the sound felt in that moment. I have told the story years later and heard many suggested explanations. Some people say I accidentally used pulse dialing. Others believe it was a crossed line. Some think it was a prank caller who happened to ring again. A few suggest the phone company had a test function that caused an automatic callback. Any of those could be true. The event happened too long ago to inspect the phone, wiring, or service. I do not remember the exact number of times I pressed the switch. I cannot identify the model of the telephone or the company that operated the line. Without those details, there is no way to reproduce the sequence. It remains a childhood memory rather than an investigation. I do not claim a demon called our house. That is the image the laughter created, not a conclusion I can prove. A human voice distorted by an old line can sound monstrous. A technical fault can occur at exactly the wrong time. A person can laugh cruelly during a prank. The rational explanations are strong. But the story still frightens me because the telephone behaved as though the laughter had intention. It waited until the clicking stopped. It filled the receiver. Then, after I broke the connection, the phone rang. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had answered. Maybe there would have been an ordinary person asking for someone in the family. Maybe there would have been silence. Perhaps the same laughter would have returned, louder now that the caller knew I was afraid. I am glad I never found out. The memory has lost some details with time, but the sound remains. I can still imagine the receiver pressed against my ear, the plastic button moving beneath my finger. Click, 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 then no click at all. Only that wild, breathless laughter coming from somewhere along the line. I remember slamming the phone down and standing there in the sudden quiet. For 1 second, I thought I had escaped whatever I had reached. Then the bell inside the phone exploded into a ring. Maybe I had accidentally dialed a prankster. Maybe an old telephone system was performing a ringback test. Maybe 2 unrelated calls crossed at the perfect moment to terrify a child. Those explanations are possible, and one of them is probably true. But even after all these years, I cannot stop thinking about how the phone seemed to answer a question I had never meant to ask. I kept opening and closing the line to see what would happen. Eventually, something on the other end laughed, and when I hung up, it called me back.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
My girlfriend and I were in my bedroom one night, just beginning to drift off to sleep, when every string on my guitar suddenly rang out at once. The guitar was standing upright against the wall beneath the mantelpiece. It was not lying flat on the floor or balanced in a place where it could easily fall. I had placed it there carefully, the way I had many times before. I had also been playing guitar for about 15 years, so I knew the instrument well. I knew what it sounded like when one string slipped. I knew the light metallic noise caused by temperature changes. I knew the softer vibration that could happen when something nearby moved. This was not any of those sounds. It was a loud, deliberate twang across all the strings at once. It sounded exactly like someone had forcefully dragged a hand across them. My girlfriend and I both woke instantly. There was no confusion about whether the sound had been part of a dream. We startled at the same moment and looked toward the guitar. The room had been quiet before it happened. We had not been talking. No music was playing. There was no television or other noise that could have been mistaken for the instrument. The chord seemed to explode out of the darkness. For anyone who does not play guitar, it may sound as though making all 6 strings ring would be easy. You only have to touch them after all. But there is a difference between accidentally brushing against the guitar and producing a loud, clear sound across every string. A weak touch might cause a faint scrape. A sleeve catching 1 or 2 strings could produce a small, uneven noise. To make them all sound together with enough volume to wake 2 people, something usually has to move across them with a certain amount of force. The motion has to pass over the full width of the strings. It does not need to be perfect, but it does need to be direct. That was what frightened me. The sound had the weight and shape of a strum. It did not seem random. I sat up and looked around the room. The guitar was still standing where I had left it. It had not fallen. It was not rocking visibly against the wall. Nothing was hanging from the strings. There was no object lying beside it that could have struck them. My girlfriend asked what had happened, even though we both knew where the sound had come from. I told her it was the guitar. Neither of us wanted to move immediately. The darkness around the instrument suddenly felt occupied. It stood beneath the mantelpiece, exactly as before. But now I kept expecting another sound. I imagined the strings moving again. I imagined the neck slowly turning away from the wall. Nothing happened. I switched on the light and got out of bed. There was one small window open in the room. That was the first possible explanation. A gust of air might have entered and disturbed the guitar. Perhaps the instrument had shifted against the wall, and the movement caused the strings to vibrate. But it had not been windy outside. The curtains were not blowing. The door had not moved. I could not feel a strong draft crossing the room. Even if there had been a light current of air, it would have been difficult for it to strike all 6 strings with that much force. Air can make strings hum or vibrate under certain conditions. It might produce a faint tone if the guitar is positioned near a fan or open window. What we heard was not a low hum. It was a sudden attack followed by the familiar decay of a forceful strum. The sound began sharply. Then the strings continued ringing and gradually faded. That is exactly what happens when a hand passes across them. I checked the mantelpiece. I thought something might have fallen from above. A coin, small ornament, key, or other object could have dropped onto the guitar and struck the strings. The object might then have bounced onto the floor or become hidden behind the instrument. I looked over everything on the mantel. Nothing appeared missing. I checked the top of the guitar, the floor around it, and the gap between the instrument and the wall. There was nothing. No object was resting inside the strings. No piece of debris had caught near the bridge. The guitar itself looked undamaged. If something heavy had fallen from the mantel, I would have expected a mark, a scratch, or at least an object nearby. I found none. I lifted the guitar and inspected the area behind it. There was no animal. A mouse or other small creature might have climbed onto the instrument and slipped across the strings. That could create a sudden noise. But there was no movement along the wall, no scratching, and no sign that anything had run away after waking us. An insect would not have enough weight or force to produce what we heard. A larger animal would have disturbed the guitar's position. The instrument remained upright. The strings were all intact. None had snapped. A breaking string can make a sharp, startling sound, and if it strikes the others, the result may be louder than expected. But every string was still in place. The tuning did not seem dramatically wrong. There was no broken end curled near the bridge or tuning pegs. I lightly brushed my fingers across the strings. The sound was immediately familiar. It was close to what had awakened us. I tried softer movements. They were not loud enough. I tried striking only 1 or 2 strings. That did not match either. To produce the same full sound, I had to sweep across most or all of them with my hand. That was the moment when I began to feel certain that the noise had been caused by a physical motion rather than the guitar simply settling. My girlfriend had heard the same thing. She was not a guitarist, but she recognized it as someone or something touching the instrument. We searched the room anyway. There was no one hiding in it. The bedroom door had been closed or remained exactly as we had left it. There were no footsteps outside, no voices, no sign that another person had entered and escaped. Even if someone had come into the room as a joke, they would have needed to walk close to the bed, strum the guitar, and leave before either of us sat up. We woke immediately. There was not enough time for someone to cross the room and disappear silently. The idea of an intruder was frightening, but it did not fit. Nothing had been stolen. No door or window showed signs of entry. The open window was small and not an easy route into the room. There was also no reason for a person to enter only to strike the guitar and then leave. We eventually returned to bed, but neither of us relaxed quickly. Every normal sound in the house became more noticeable. Wood shifted. Pipes made small noises. The wind moved faintly outside. None of it sounded like the guitar. I kept watching it in the darkness. Part of me expected it to happen again. Another full chord. One string plucked slowly, the instrument falling forward even though no one was near it. Nothing else happened that night. The silence after the first sound made the incident feel even more deliberate. There had been one clear action. Then, nothing. If temperature or air pressure were causing the strings to move, I might have expected more faint vibrations. If an animal were nearby, I might hear scratching or movement. If the guitar were unstable, it might shift again. Instead, it stayed completely still after waking us. The next day, I tried to recreate the sound. I wanted a practical explanation. I placed the guitar in the same position against the wall, beneath the mantelpiece. I examined the angle. I checked whether the body could rock forward and strike something. I pushed lightly against the floor to see if vibration caused the instrument to move. The guitar stayed steady. Then I started dropping objects onto it. I used items that might reasonably have fallen from the mantelpiece. I tried different sizes and weights. I dropped them from different heights. Some struck the body and made dull knocks. Some touched the strings and caused one or two notes to ring. A few bounced away. None created the same full, forceful sound. If I aimed an object directly at the strings, it usually hit only a small section. To make every string sound, the object needed to be wide or move across them. A falling item did not naturally create that sweeping motion. I also tried allowing the guitar to shift against the wall. I moved it slightly and let it settle. The strings sometimes produced faint vibrations, but nothing close to what we heard. I tilted it carefully. I allowed the neck to touch the wall. I moved the floor nearby. The instrument creaked or knocked, but it did not strum itself. The more I tested it, the less satisfied I became with the accidental explanations. That does not mean there was no natural cause. It only means I could not reproduce it with the obvious ones. Musical instruments are sensitive objects. Wood changes with temperature and humidity. Metal strings stretch and contract. Tension builds in the neck, bridge, and tuning hardware. A string can stick briefly in the nut and then release. That release can produce a sharp sound. If several strings shift at nearly the same moment, perhaps they could create something resembling a chord. The guitar had been standing near a wall, beneath a mantelpiece, beside a room with an open window. The temperature may have changed as night air entered. The wood might have cooled unevenly. A change in tension could have caused the instrument to move or the strings to release. That is a real possibility. But strings reacting to temperature normally do not sound as though someone strummed all of them in sequence. They may ping individually. A tuning peg may slip. One string might suddenly drop in pitch. What we heard was broad and immediate. It had the short, uneven sweep of a hand moving across the set. The strings did not all seem to begin at the exact same instant, which might happen if the whole instrument vibrated. There was the tiny progression that comes from moving from one side to the other. That is why my experience as a guitarist mattered. I recognized the action from the sound. I had made that noise thousands of times. I knew how it was produced. At least I believed I did. Another possibility is sympathetic vibration. A loud sound elsewhere can make guitar strings vibrate without direct contact. If a heavy vehicle passes, a door slams, a speaker produces a certain frequency, or something strikes the wall, the guitar may resonate. Individual strings respond strongly to frequencies close to their tuning. The body of the guitar can amplify those vibrations. Perhaps a low noise outside or elsewhere in the house caused all the strings to ring. Because we were drifting off, we might not have consciously heard the original sound. The guitar's response could have seemed isolated. But sympathetic vibration usually creates sustained ringing or humming. It does not normally produce the sharp scraping attack of a strum. A strong enough shock could make the strings move against the frets, creating a more percussive sound. Yet we did not feel the wall shake. No object fell. The bed did not move. There was no passing truck or slammed door that either of us remembered. The room had been still. The guitar alone reacted. Sleep also complicates the memory. We were just drifting off. Neither of us may have been fully asleep, but we were in that uncertain stage where the mind begins mixing real surroundings with dream imagery. A sudden noise can be interpreted incorrectly when someone wakes. Perhaps the guitar made a smaller sound, and our startled minds enlarged it. Maybe one string slipped, but we remembered a full chord because the sound was unexpected. The fact that both of us woke does not prove we interpreted it accurately. We heard the same real noise, but fear may have shaped it. Still, we compared what we heard immediately. We both believed all the strings had sounded. Neither of us suggested a single snap, ping, or knock. Our first shared understanding was that someone had strummed the guitar. There is a sleep phenomenon sometimes described as an explosive noise at the edge of sleep. A person may hear a bang, crash, shout, or electrical sound that has no external source. It can feel completely real and cause someone to wake suddenly. But it would be extremely unusual for both of us to experience the same imagined guitar sound at the same time. One person could have had the sleep-related event and startled the other awake. Then the second person might have assumed the guitar made the noise because of the reaction. But my girlfriend heard it directly. She did not wake only because I moved. We both startled with the sound. That suggests something physical occurred in the room. The question is, what? I have considered whether the guitar pick might have been lodged somewhere and fallen through the strings. A pick caught between the strings near the neck or body could slide loose and produce a quick strum-like noise. If it fell afterward, it might have landed somewhere difficult to notice. But I did not find a pick on or behind the instrument. A pick is also very light. It might brush the strings, but producing a loud chord would require the right angle and enough speed. Gravity alone might do it if the pick began high enough, though I never recreated the exact sound. A loose strap, cable, or piece of fabric could also move across the strings. The guitar did not have anything hanging in a position that explained it. Nothing was swaying when we turned on the light. Perhaps the instrument slowly shifted until the strings caught on an edge of the mantelpiece or wall. When the contact suddenly released, the strings were plucked together. That would create a sound without leaving an object behind. However, the strings faced outward into the room. They were not pressed against the wall. The guitar's body and neck would prevent the playing surface from contacting anything behind it. Something would need to approach from the front. That is the space where I imagined a hand. I do not know whether the room or house had any history of paranormal activity. There were no constant apparitions, voices, or objects flying through the air. We did not regularly experience things that made us believe the place was haunted. That night did not begin with an unusual atmosphere. We were simply going to sleep. The guitar incident stood alone. That makes a physical explanation more likely. A haunting usually becomes convincing through a pattern. Repeated footsteps, doors moving, several witnesses seeing the same figure. One unexplained sound may only be an accident that happened under conditions we could not identify. I try to remember that. A single event does not prove that a ghost entered the room and played the guitar. But isolation can also make an incident more disturbing. There was no gradual buildup. Nothing warned us. The silence was broken by one deliberate-looking action. Then the room returned to normal. It felt less like a malfunction and more like a signal. Someone or something wanted to produce that sound once. That is only how it felt, not what I can prove. The supernatural explanation is simple in one sense. An unseen presence passed a hand across the strings. That would account for the sound perfectly. It would explain why no object was found and why the instrument did not need to move. It would also explain why my attempts to recreate the event with falling objects failed. But it creates much larger problems. If something could physically touch the strings, why did it do so? Why that night? Why only once? Why wake both of us and then remain silent? There was no message in the chord. The strings were not tuned to create a meaningful melody. It was only a violent sound. Perhaps the point was to make us aware that we were not alone. Maybe it wanted attention. Or perhaps we startled it somehow. Those ideas are pure speculation. Nothing else happened to support them. What stays with me is my confidence as a guitarist. I have heard instruments make strange noises. A guitar left in a room may creak as the wood changes. Strings may ring faintly when someone walks past. The neck can settle, hardware can buzz, an amplifier can hum. I know those sounds. This was a strum. It was loud enough to wake us both from the edge of sleep. The attack was strong. The strings rang together. There was enough force behind it that my first instinct was not to check whether the guitar had shifted. My first instinct was to wonder who had touched it. The next day's tests did not prove anything, but they strengthened that impression. Objects falling from the mantel produced the wrong sounds. Movement against the wall produced the wrong sounds. Air from the window did nothing. The only reliable way I could recreate what we heard was to use my hand. I had to reach across the strings and strike them. That does not mean an invisible hand did it. There may have been a precise combination of gravity, tension, airflow, and contact I fail to reproduce. Accidents are often difficult to recreate because the exact conditions happen only once. The guitar may have been positioned at a slightly different angle. A tiny object could have fallen and later rolled somewhere I never checked. A string may have shifted at the same moment the body moved. The room's temperature may have changed rapidly. Any of those explanations is more likely than a ghost, but none feels as accurate as the sound itself. My girlfriend and I remained unsettled for a while afterward. The guitar stayed in the room, but I became more aware of where I placed it. I may have laid it down or moved it away from the bed. I did not want to wake to the same noise again. For several nights, I listened for it. Nothing happened. The strings remained silent unless I touched them. Eventually, the fear faded. The incident became a story we told rather than something we expected to repeat. Years later, I still think about it whenever a guitar makes an unexpected noise. A faint string vibration can take me back to that bedroom. I remember lying beside my girlfriend in the darkness. I remember the sudden blast of all 6 strings. I remember both of us sitting up at the same time. Then I remember looking at the instrument and seeing no one near it. Maybe the open window created a pressure change. Maybe the guitar shifted against the wall. Maybe something tiny fell from the mantel and escaped our search. Maybe the wood and strings released stored tension in a way I had never heard before. I would gladly accept any of those explanations if one could produce the same sound. But after 15 years of playing, I knew what a guitar sounded like when it was brushed, bumped, dropped, or left to settle. That night, it did not sound as though the instrument moved by itself. It sounded as though someone standing in the dark had reached across it and struck every string with one confident sweep. We turned on the light immediately. The room was empty. The guitar was exactly where I had left it. And the only thing missing was the hand that had just played it. My sister died by suicide 10 years ago when I was 16. The day I found out, I could not accept that she had simply left without saying anything to me. The news itself did not feel real. People were speaking, moving around, crying, and trying to explain what had happened, but none of it seemed connected to the world I had woken up in that morning. My mind kept returning to one thought. She had to have left me a note. Not necessarily a long letter. It did not need to explain everything. I only believed there had to be something, even one sentence, that she had written for me. She could not have disappeared without leaving me anything. As soon as I had the chance, I ran upstairs to my bedroom. I do not know exactly why I expected a note to be there. Maybe I thought she had hidden it among my belongings because she knew I would look. Perhaps I wanted to believe she had visited my room before she died and left behind some final proof that she had been thinking about me. I searched everywhere. I opened every drawer and removed the contents. I looked beneath clothes, notebooks, and anything else that could hide a folded piece of paper. I checked under the bed. I moved objects from the side table. I looked behind furniture and along the floor. I searched places that made no sense because I was desperate to find something. There was no note. I went through the room more than once. Each time I reached the end of the search, I felt as though I must have missed it. I would return to the drawers and look again. Slower this time. Nothing appeared. Eventually, the rest of that day passed in the way terrible days do. There were conversations I barely remember. People came and went. The same questions were repeated. My family tried to understand something that could not be repaired by understanding it. By the time night came, I was exhausted. I went back to my room and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, there was a note on my side table. It was not hidden. It was not inside a drawer or beneath anything. It was sitting where I could see it. The note was short. It said, "I'm sorry." My sister had signed it. The handwriting looked like hers. I recognized the way she formed the letters. I had known her handwriting for years. It did not look like an unfamiliar person had tried to imitate it. It looked like something she had written herself. I remember staring at it and trying to understand how it could be there. I had searched the side table the day before. I had moved things and looked around it. The note had not been there. At least, I was certain it had not. I brought it to my mother, or told her what I had found. She did not believe my explanation. To this day, she believes I wrote it myself for attention. I understand why she came to that conclusion. I was 16, grieving, and desperate for a message from my sister. I had spent the previous day searching for exactly that. Then, the following morning, a note appeared beside my bed. From the outside, it probably looked as though I had written what I wanted to find. Maybe I wanted comfort. Maybe I wanted the family to believe my sister had reached out to me. Maybe grief had pushed me into doing something I did not fully understand. That is the explanation my mother accepted. But I know I did not write it. I did not create the note for attention. I did not place it on the table and then pretend to discover it. I also do not remember waking during the night and writing anything. Could I have done it in a half-asleep or dissociated state? Possibly, grief can affect memory in frightening ways. A person can perform ordinary actions and later have little or no memory of them. Severe shock can make time feel fragmented. I may have found an old piece of my sister's writing without realizing it, carried it into the room, and later interpreted it as new. There may have been a simple sequence of events that my mind failed to preserve. I cannot prove there was not. Another family member could have found the note elsewhere and placed it beside my bed. Perhaps they wanted to comfort me, but later became afraid to admit what they had done. Someone might have believed it was genuinely written by my sister and thought I should have it, but no one ever confessed to placing it there. My mother's belief that I wrote it seemed sincere. She was not protecting another person. As far as I know, no one in the family claimed responsibility. It is also possible that the note had been on the table the entire time and I missed it. That is difficult for me to accept because I had searched the room so aggressively. I pulled drawers apart. I checked under the bed. I examined the side table because it was an obvious place for a note. But grief narrows attention. I may have looked directly at the paper without processing it. People often fail to see objects that are in front of them when they are overwhelmed. The note might have been beneath another item, stuck to the table, or turned over so that I did not recognize it. During the night, it could have shifted into view. A fan, movement from the bed, or another person entering the room might have displaced it. That explanation is possible. Still, my memory of the room is clear. There was nothing there before I slept. Then there was a note. The words were exactly what I needed and feared to hear. I'm sorry. It was not a detailed goodbye. It did not explain why she died or answer any of the questions we had. It was only an apology. That made it feel more believable to me. If I had invented a message, I think I would have written more. I would have wanted reassurance. I would have wanted her to say she loved me, or that none of it was my fault. The note did not offer that kind of comfort. It sounded incomplete, like the only thing she had been able to say. I kept the experience with me, even though my mother dismissed it. For years, I did not know whether to think of the note as a message, a coincidence, an old piece of paper, or something my grieving mind had somehow created. Then, last year, something happened near the anniversary of my sister's death. It was 2 days before the date. By then, I was living with my fiancé and our 4 cats. Cats behave strangely for ordinary reasons. Anyone who has lived with them knows that they stare at empty walls, run through rooms for no obvious reason, react to tiny sounds, and follow movements humans cannot detect. They hear much higher frequencies than we do. They smell animals and insects hidden inside walls. They notice vibrations from pipes, heating systems, and activity outside. I know that. I do not assume every unusual thing a cat does is paranormal. But that night, all 4 of them reacted together. I woke at around 2 in the morning. Every cat was in the bedroom. They were all staring at the bedroom door. Their fur was raised. They were growling, not playing, not watching one another. All 4 were focused on the same point. The bedroom door was closed, or partly closed, and they seemed convinced that something was on the other side. Seeing one cat behave that way would have been unsettling. Seeing 4 cats do it at exactly the same time was different. Their bodies were tense. Their attention did not break when I moved. They looked frightened and defensive. I got out of bed and tried to find an explanation. I checked for a bug. A moth, spider, or other insect could easily attract all of them. Maybe something had crawled under the door. I looked near the floor and around the frame. I found nothing. I listened for movement in the hallway. There were no obvious footsteps. No scratching, no voices. I opened the bedroom door and searched outside. The cats did not follow. That was unusual. Normally, if they thought an animal or insect was nearby, they would want to chase it. Instead, they stayed in the bedroom. I walked through the house, checking the rooms. I looked for signs that someone had entered. I checked doors and windows. Nothing seemed disturbed. There was no person hiding inside. No animal had gotten in. I did not find a fallen object, leaking pipe, or appliance making a strange sound. The house looked normal. I returned to the bedroom. The cats were still behaving strangely. I went to the kitchen and picked up their treats. Usually the sound of the bag or container was enough to bring them running. All four of them knew that sound. They would normally appear immediately, even if they had been sleeping somewhere else. That night, they refused to leave the bedroom. The treats did not matter. Whatever had their attention seemed more important than food. That was when I became seriously uncomfortable. Animals can ignore treats when frightened, but I still could not identify what had frightened all four of them. I woke my fiancé and told him what was happening. I asked him to search the house. He got up and checked. He did not find anything either. From his perspective, the cats were probably reacting to a sound inside a wall or some animal outside. He called me crazy or told me I was overreacting, then returned to bed. I remained awake longer. Eventually, the cats became quiet enough that I managed to fall asleep again. I do not know how much time passed before I woke for the second time. The situation had reversed. The cats were now in the hallway. They were staring into the bedroom. They refused to come inside. Earlier, they had stayed in the room and watched the door as though something was outside. Now they were outside and staring inward as though whatever had frightened them had entered the bedroom. I called them. They did not move. 4 cats stood in the hallway, looking into the room but refusing to cross the doorway. The sight created an immediate feeling that I was not alone. I could not see anyone. Nothing in the room had changed. My fiancé was there. The furniture was in its normal position. But I felt watched. It was not proof of anything. Fear can create a sense of presence, especially when someone wakes suddenly at night. Once I saw the cats refusing to enter, my mind searched the dark corners of the room for a reason. Every shadow became more noticeable. The anniversary of my sister's death was also approaching. Even if I had not been consciously thinking about it before going to sleep, part of me knew the date. Grief anniversaries can affect mood, dreams, sleep, and anxiety without the person recognizing the connection immediately. That may have shaped everything I felt. Still, the cats' behavior was external. They were all looking into the same room. They all remained outside. I could not explain that through my emotions alone. Trying to break the tension, I spoke out loud. I said it partly as a joke. "Okay, Stephanie, you can stop now." Stephanie was my sister's name. As soon as I said it, the cats changed. They stood up or relaxed. They stopped staring. They began walking around normally. They entered the room and behaved as though nothing had happened. There was no gradual return to normal. The tension seemed to end immediately after I said her name. That timing is why I connected the incident to her. It was 2 days before the anniversary of her death. The cats had reacted to something I could not see. They first refused to leave the bedroom, then later refused to enter it. I felt watched. Then I addressed my sister directly, and everything stopped. I know how that sounds. There are ordinary explanations. The cats may have been reacting to a mouse, insect, or animal inside the wall. Whatever they heard could have moved from the hallway side to another part of the room, explaining why their positions changed. By the time I spoke, the sound may have stopped naturally. The cats relaxed because the stimulus disappeared, not because I said my sister's name. The timing may have been coincidence. That is probably the most reasonable explanation. 4 cats share the same environment, so they can all react to one sound humans cannot hear. A rodent moving through a wall can hold their attention for a long time. Heating pipes may knock, vibrate, and change location as water or air moves through them. An animal outside a window could produce a scent or noise. The cats might have heard something near the door, followed it mentally as it moved, and later lost interest at the exact moment I spoke. My voice itself may have interrupted their fixation. When I said the sentence, my tone may have changed. I might have sat up, moved, or turned on a light. The cats could have taken those cues as a signal that there was no danger. They may have relaxed because I relaxed after speaking. Animals respond closely to human posture and emotion. There is no need to assume they saw my sister, but I cannot ignore how precise the moment felt. They had resisted treats. They had remained tense during the search. They had changed positions and continued watching. Then I said Stephanie's name, and the entire event ended. It reminded me of the note. Both incidents happened during periods of intense connection to her death. The first occurred the night after she died. The second occurred just before the anniversary. Both involved something brief, personal, and impossible to prove afterward. The note could have been missed, moved, or written during shock. The cats could have been reacting to a sound. There are explanations for both. Yet the emotional connection is difficult for me to dismiss. I do not necessarily believe my sister was trying to frighten me. If she was somehow present, I do not think the cat's fear means she had become something dangerous. Animals may react to unfamiliar sounds or sensations even when there is no threat. Maybe the strange atmosphere came from my own fear, and the cats responded to me. Perhaps saying her name allowed me to release that fear, which then allowed them to calm down. That would still connect the incident to grief without requiring anything supernatural. There is also the possibility that I interpreted ordinary animal behavior through the anniversary. Had the same thing happened during another month, I might have blamed a mouse and forgotten it. Because it happened 2 days before the date, I connected it to Stephanie. The human mind searches for meaning around loss. Anniversaries, songs, dreams, misplaced objects, and animal behavior can all feel like messages. Sometimes that meaning is created by us because the alternative is accepting complete silence from someone we loved. That does not make the experience dishonest. The comfort or fear can be real even when the cause is uncertain. I have lived for years with people doubting the note. My mother's accusation hurt because it turned something deeply personal into attention-seeking. I had just lost my sister. I wanted evidence that she had not left me without a word. Then, a note appeared, and the person I most needed to believe me decided I had written it myself. I cannot prove she was wrong. The paper did not appear in front of a witness. There was no recording of the room. No one examined the handwriting professionally. The note may no longer exist, or at least I do not know whether it could be tested now. All I have is my memory of seeing my sister's handwriting and knowing I had not written it. The cat incident had more witnesses in one sense. My fiancé saw at least part of their behavior, although he did not interpret it the way I did. All 4 animals reacted. The change after I spoke was immediate, but even that is not proof. Coincidences can be exact. A sound can stop at the same moment someone says a name. The more emotionally important the name is, the more meaningful the coincidence feels. I try to hold both possibilities. Maybe my sister left the note before she died, and I somehow missed it during the search. Maybe someone found it and placed it beside me. Maybe my mind protected me from remembering how it arrived. Maybe the cats heard something in the walls. Maybe the anniversary made me connect unrelated events. Those are reasonable explanations. But there is another possibility I cannot completely let go of. Maybe the note appeared because Stephanie knew I needed something from her. Maybe, years later, whatever presence unsettled the cats was connected to her. Perhaps saying her name acknowledged that I knew she was there. And that was enough. I do not know what happens after death. I do not know whether people can visit, leave signs, or affect animals. I would never use these experiences to claim certainty. Grief is too complicated, memory is too unreliable, and cats are too strange. But the two events have stayed with me because they both carried the same feeling. It was not simply fear, it was recognition. When I saw the note, I recognized her handwriting. When I said her name to the empty room, something in the situation seemed to recognize it too. Maybe that recognition existed only inside me. Perhaps I had spent 10 years wanting the note to be real and wanting some sign that my sister was still connected to my life. The anniversary brought that need closer to the surface. If so, the experiences still reveal something true about grief. A person can be gone for a decade and still feel close enough that one sentence spoken into a dark room changes everything. I think about the wording of the note often. I'm sorry. It could mean many things. She might have been apologizing for leaving, for the pain, for not saying goodbye, for whatever suffering led her to that decision. Or it might have been an old note about something completely unrelated, given a new meaning by where and when I found it. That possibility is painful too. The note may never have been intended as a final message. I may have turned it into one, because I needed to. But if I had written it myself for attention, as my mother believed, I would know that. I would remember the lie, even if I regretted it later. I do not. My memory is of searching, finding nothing, sleeping, and waking to her handwriting beside me. Last year, I did not call out to Stephanie because I was certain she was haunting the room. I said it because the situation was strange and because humor was easier than fear. The sentence came naturally. Okay, Stephanie, you can stop now. Then the cats relaxed. Maybe they were already about to stop. Maybe my voice broke their concentration. Maybe the animal inside the wall moved away. But watching all four of them return to normal at once made the room feel different. The sense of being watched disappeared. I was left with the same problem I had faced as a teenager. Something had happened. There was no evidence that would convince anyone else. And the person I most associated with it was not there to explain. I do not think every strange event around the anniversary is a message from my sister. I do not search for her in every shadow or sound. I know grief can encourage people to see patterns. I also know that accepting uncertainty is healthier than building certainty from coincidences. Still, I cannot completely dismiss these two nights. The first time I was 16 and had spent an entire day begging for one last word from her. I woke and found 2 words and a signature. The second time, 10 years later, 4 frightened animals stared at an empty doorway until I spoke her name. Both incidents ended before I could investigate them properly. Both left me with nothing but memory. Maybe my mother was right about the note. Maybe my fiancé was right about the cats. Perhaps shock, sleep, animals, and coincidence explain all of it. I know that is possible. But I also know what it felt like to find that paper after searching every part of the room. And I know how quickly 4 terrified cats became ordinary again after I spoke to someone who had been dead for almost 10 years. I do not claim that Stephanie came back. I only know that the first message appeared when I could not accept her silence. And years later, when the whole room felt as though someone unseen was watching me, I said her name once. Whatever had the cats frightened stopped.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.